Most of you are probably familiar with the old grade school rhyme, "In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue," which more than one of your teachers likely used to help you remember the date of Christopher Columbus's first voyage from Europe to the Americas. Puerile though the mnemonic device is, it is helpful, and the event itself is indeed as important as its usual given emphasis suggests. This is because history prior to the 16th century was a story of regional narratives that didn't cross one another frequently, or even, in the case of the Americas, really at all. There had been empires that had conquered and held large swathes of territory at various points in the preceding millennia, of course, from Alexander the Great to the Roman Empire, the Safavid Persian to the Han Chinese, Mughals and Mongols, etc. However, these were almost as a rule administratively decentralized, ethnically, linguistically, religiously heterogeneous, and, as you'll see from the maps on the PowerPoint slide, often had very little to do with other empires, civilizations, etc. This is not to say they had nothing to do with one another. There are records of Roman delegations to the Chinese imperial court during the age of the Antonine, just to take one of many such examples. It is simply to state as a general rule that the kinds of sustained, high levels of interaction that would become increasingly common after 1500 just did not exist, and that the history of the world prior to 1500 is almost entirely one of different regional histories with little reference to other civilizations or political entities. Beginning in 1500, however, the hitherto regional narratives begin to become conjoined. The reasons for this are many, and several of the subsequent lectures will be devoted to explaining precisely how and why these narratives became fused into essentially one, generally Eurocentric story. Now, at this point, I don't want to get bogged down in trying to explain how this came to be. We'll have plenty of time for that later, a whole semester, in fact. The purpose of this first lecture is to provide some initial context for the topics that will occupy us going forward, that is, the world since 1500. Toward the end of this lecture, I'll also begin introducing the first of our regions of interest, the far east of the Asian continent, the civilization of China. Given that this is a level 100 survey course, I'm going to keep things surface level and to the point. The evolution of societies, polities, economies, it's all exceedingly complicated, rife with differences and exceptions. The point of a survey course is not to overwhelm undergraduates completing some gen ed requirements by delving into these often opaque intricacies. The purpose is to broaden the knowledge of the students as they likely go on to other fields, while perhaps firing the interest of a few who will then go on to more extensive studies in history. By necessity, therefore, I'm going to make a lot of generalizations. And if any of you ever feel cheated by this, you have my apologies in advance, and you can always come talk to me if you'd like some stouter reading recommendations to really sink your teeth into. On that note, not knowing how much of a background in history any of you have, I'm going to spend the first portion of this lecture trying to get everyone up to speed on essentially how we got to the basic civilizational picture we'll be working with going forward. That is, the regional narratives tied to the Chinese, Persian, Ottoman, European, and American regions around the year 1500. So let's start with some basics, food and shelter. Now, if you go way back several thousand years, we have what's referred to as the agricultural revolution. This was basically the domestication of animal wildlife, which allowed humanity to transition from the hunter-gatherer to the fixed settlement pattern of existence. This enabled the growth of larger settlements, higher birth rates, and the eventual diversification of labor. Basically, if you don't have everyone hunting or growing their own food, you can afford to have some people in the society start to produce specific goods for others to use their produce to trade for. Even so, even once this happens, it isn't until the 19th century, really the 20th century, that the overwhelming majority of human beings on Earth cease to be employed in farming. Most all of these early civilizational hubs sprouted near great rivers, the Nile, Ganges, Yellow, etc. The reasons for this are several, from irrigation to ease of transport to soil enrichment. Now, how these burgeoning settlements developed into more complex social forms like kingdoms and empires is a bit speculative. One of the more popularly accepted theories is that of the, quote, stationary bandit. That is, essentially, groups of armed men decided to cut a deal with the city dwellers. You give us food, shelter, position, etc., and not only will we not sack the town, we'll defend it from other groups of, well, guys like us. There are also theories of state formation related to social contract theory and Marxism, but let's simply leave it at that kingdoms emerged out of these concentrations of people and resources and move on to an observation about distance. The tyranny of distance. It wasn't until the 19th century and the advent of the telegraph that a message could get from point A to point B faster than a fellow on horseback. So from ancient times to the Pony Express of the American West, there was basically no change in that regard. Of course, there were some innovations: the saddle, which generally allowed riders more control and endurance, improvements in roads that allowed for smoother travel, but these were incremental improvements, not transformative ones. This matters because something a ruler or government needs if it is going to effectively extract the resources it needs to sustain itself is the ability to administer its territory, to communicate, give orders, receive information, build up the loyalty of its distant peoples, etc. This last relates to a modern problem, that of nationalism, which we'll speak to more in just a moment. But first, let's take a look now at this first slide for some illustrations of what I mean. A quick note about PowerPoint slides. While I am going to use them, I'm going to use them sparingly, and they will almost always be confined to illustrations or other types of graphics. The reason for this is fairly simple. If you put up lots of slides with lots of text, what happens is everyone disengages from the lecture and starts dutifully copying down whatever is on the slides. This is, in my experience, unnecessary and often quite counterproductive. Particularly where history is concerned, what we're doing here is telling a story. And at least in my classes, what I'm concerned with isn't whether you can tell me that the 30 Years' War ended in 1648. Rather, I want you to be able to tell me the general story of how religion and politics combined in a way that produced a series of conflicts in modern day Germany between rival Catholic and Protestant powers so terrible that henceforth wars over religion in Europe were to greatly diminish and eventually cease. So this slide you see here, in opening, I talked about the various regional empires not having much real sustained contact. You can see here the Han and Roman empires at their peak. Though these were contemporaneous, really, they couldn't have much to do with one another. That's on the top right here. Next to them, top left, you have the briefly lived Mongol Empire, the largest the world would see until the British Empire of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Bottom left, you see the Mughal Empire, and bottom right is the Achaemenid Persian Empire of Greek lore. As we turn to the next slide, what we find is that these empires fragmented rather easily due to their decentralized and heterogeneous nature, again, as we already mentioned. To this day, in India, for example, there remain several hundred officially recognized different ethno-linguistic groups. One of the reasons English was retained as the official language of government, even after the British had gone. In the case of the Mongols, it was divided by civil war almost as soon as Genghis Khan's grandson Mongke died. Similarly, in the case of the Achaemenids, bottom right again, no sooner had Alexander conquered them than he died, and his generals divided up the empire. The Mughal and Roman empires were divided up along essentially different tribal or ethnic lines, as you can see. And then in China, you had a combination of these two phenomena occurring during the so-called Warring States period. What made these huge agglomerations of territory possible was the ability to deploy large amounts of concentrated force. Nothing much else held them together, apart from, in cases like the Roman example, a desire to live inside the empire to enjoy the relative peace and possibility of prosperity that it offered. When you look at your textbook, Chapter 1, the reading for this week, the quiz over which is already open and which is due by midnight Saturday, you'll find a great dynamic map illustrating the expansion and almost immediate breakup and fragmentation of the great Mongol Empire we were just talking about. This breakup is illustrative of one of Gibbon's classic quips. Gibbon was an 18th century Englishman most famous for authoring The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. A great book, even if the prose grows as turgid as the subject matter does arcane. But what Gibbon said was that given the immense number of centrifugal forces at work, we ought not really to wonder that the Roman Empire declined and fell when it did, but rather we should wonder at how it lasted as long as it did. And on the subject, it was Gibbon's belief that it was the adoption of Christianity that fatally weakened the Roman Empire. And while it is generally accepted to have been a factor, there were literally 100 other reasons, many of them such as failure to properly assimilate large numbers of Germanic tribespeople, which were of far more importance than the supplanting of the old Roman pantheon of gods borrowed from the Greeks. For example, one of the problems that exceedingly plagued the Roman Empire was that the emperor was increasingly unwilling to put generals into the field with large armies to deal with the increasingly numerous threats to the empire. The reason was simple. Your general today is your replacement tomorrow. This is something which will recur throughout history. In the Chinese Civil War, for example, in the 1930s, Chiang Kai-shek frustrated the American military attaché General Stilwell to no end for his unwillingness to share any power or even any real information with anyone else who might eventually become a rival, even if it meant being invaded and beaten back by the Japanese for years. One thing you'll find in history is that what the most durable empires had in common, apart from a relative lack of serious militarily capable rivals on its borders, or some kind of organizational or technological advantage, was a linguistically homogeneous professional bureaucracy. That is, a group of administrators whose loyalty is to the state rather than to any individual within the state. The Romans went through that period of professionalization during the years of Augustus's reorganization of the Republic following the end of the third round of civil wars, those following those of Sulla, his uncle, and then his own. The British went through this when they replaced the East India Company and other commercial ventures with Foreign Service Office officials. And the American Empire, too, went through this process in the years immediately following the World Wars, in particular the end of the Second World War. As we'll see, China had an exceptional bureaucracy that, perhaps more than anything else, is responsible for China being arguably the oldest, continually maintained civilizational political entity on Earth. Before we move on to China, the subject for this week, I want to share a couple more slides with you here to illustrate the transient nature of history of states and of societies. Um, First is an illustration of the British Empire, a scant 100 years ago, as opposed to London's possessions now. That's quite the change. And then you see this person right here, Percy Bysshe Shelley. His wife, Mary, of course, authored the great 19th century English novel Frankenstein, and he wrote a poem that I think captures this quite nicely. This fact of history. It goes like this. I met a traveler from an antique land who said two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command. Tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked him and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Osmandius, king of kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, in despair. Nothing beside remains round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sand stretch far away. Of course, what he's saying here is that no matter how great the works or the accomplishments of all human civilization, they are transient, and one is, of course, meant to reflect on one's own society and its own inherent transience. Now, arguably the best way to hold together an empire is to leave people alone culturally and tax them as little as possible. But then you might ask, what kind of empire is that? A fair question, and one we'll certainly delve into later in our discussion, and in the context of later European state formation and the nationalities question, or what we today generally refer to as nationalism. To illustrate the kinds of problems we'll encounter, take a look at Yugoslavia, or the Kingdom of the Southern Slavs, a state which no longer exists. It disintegrated in a round of horrible civil wars in the early 1990s when the Croats, Slovenes, Serbs, and Bosnians all fought it out to achieve self-rule for their individual group. That's oversimplifying, but this is a survey level course. Lest you think Yugoslavia exceptional, and I suppose in some ways, to paraphrase Tolstoy, all unhappy families are exceptional in their own way. If you travel to Italy, for example, in the north of the country, especially in the northeast, you'll find whole villages where the people speak predominantly German, have signage posted in both Italian and German, and some of whom desire to be part of Austria again. And if you look at this next slide, you'll see that many of the other states we think of today in Europe as being monoglot and homogeneous were in fact not so at all if we go back several hundred years, or in the case of Germany, just a couple hundred years. In France today, over 1 million people still speak Provençal as opposed to Parisian French. And Germany, where linguistically and religiously homogeneous, politically it was highly fractured into hundreds of little individual political units until the 19th century. And of course, the northern half was Protestant and the southern half was predominantly Catholic. History really is, in the words of the 20th century French historian Marc Bloch, the science of change. Okay, so with that all in mind, let's spend the rest of the time today talking about China. The first chapter of your book focuses almost exclusively on China, its cultural history, and its relations with nearby peoples, such as the Mongols. And the authors have you understand that by 1500, the beginning of the modern period, that's capital M modern, China was the most economically and technologically advanced polity on Earth, along with being the oldest and most populous. Now, this is all true, and in terms of understanding China, and particularly its incredible longevity, as you'll see here in a moment, the earliest antecedents of Chinese civilization reach all the way back to the time of pharaohs, Khufu and Khafre, the commissioners of the Great Pyramids you can still see in Egypt today. China is, in the words of the now deceased American political scientist Lucian Pye, best understood historically as a civilization rather than a state. Now, what he meant by that is that the territory that constituted quote unquote China changed significantly over the millennia, as did the nature and origins of its rulers. While what remained the same, the glue, if you will, its defining characteristics, were cultural, the language and religion first and foremost. Much like medieval European history, then, and perhaps even more so, it is impossible to tell a neat linear story of the history of China. There's a great deal of division and interruption, with well over 50 recorded dynasties, though many of these were minor. And often, there were competing dynasties coexisting simultaneously, each occupying different parts of the territory of what today we call China. So actually, before we go any further, I'd like you to direct your attention back to our PowerPoint slides here, because what you see are a series of illustrations depicting the various territorial holdings of some of the most significant of the Chinese imperial dynasties, beginning with the Xia. Now, much like the founding of Rome, there's a significant degree of mythology surrounding this dynasty. In fact, there is far more than in the case of Rome, because it is significantly older, allegedly. In fact, there is an entire school of Chinese historians who doubt its actual existence and attribute it to later dynasties seeking to justify their own rules, specifically the Zhou, who we'll talk about here in just a moment. However, you can see several important things from this quote unquote alleged first dynasty. The first things to note is its location on the Yellow River in the North China Plain. And this is important because even though China is to this day very much heterogeneous, with something like 50 different officially recognized ethno-linguistic groups, it is the ethnically Han Mandarin-speaking peoples who we mean when we talk about quote unquote the Chinese. At least that's who I mean. And I suppose I shouldn't speak for anyone else, but that is generally the case. And this is the area where the Han are said to have originated. Now, this semi-mythical Xia dynasty is alleged to have been supplanted by the Shang, who through virtuous rule and successful wars expanded the territory controlled by the burgeoning quote-unquote Chinese Empire. They are then in turn displaced by the Zhou, who I just mentioned. And one thing you know in these early historical accounts, and this is something that will recur throughout, is this idea of eventual degeneracy. That is, the initial leaders are strong, virtuous, etc. And then as the generations pass, the leadership becomes degenerate and lose the right to rule. The Zhou were the first to allegedly formulate this idea of the quote unquote mandate of heaven. And it extended not just to a ruler doing a poor job ruling, but even things like natural disasters or famines occurring could be interpreted as an emperor having lost the right to rule, and this could provoke rebellions. Now, these early kingdoms were patrimonial, that is, not professionalized. They were essentially run by members of the emperor's own family, including those that had been brought in by marriage or brought in symbolically as vassals. And these would usually be powerful local warlords, barons, if you want to think about it in the medieval European context, if that's helpful. Maintaining stability can be a challenge in that context, however, especially in an area as large as China. In the case of the Zhou, as you can see here, this was an area larger than modern-day France, and a revolt among various powerful vassals leads to the Warring States period, in fact. Now, out of this emerges the Han Dynasty, and though it quickly breaks down, plunging the region into another period of competing kingdoms, it is significant because the territorial extent of the empire will essentially remain unchanged as we move through the next several hundred years, essentially until the Mongols and later the Manchus roll in. But before we talk about these foreign invasions, I'd like to talk briefly about the professionalization of the Chinese state, which occurs during the Tang and Song dynasties. Now, since the reading for this week spends a considerable amount of time on this, as well as on Confucianism, which we'll talk about here in a few minutes, I'm not going to spend too much time going into the details of the imperial examinations that produced the scholar officials who staffed the Chinese civil service. However, I do just want to say a few things about them because they're extremely important. They began in approximately the 6th century under the Sui dynasty, but they really take hold under the Tang dynasty, which follows, and they were expanded under the Song. Generally speaking, the exams were meritocratic. That is, they were open to anyone regardless of their birth, and their purpose was to undermine military aristocratic dominance by creating a single unifying literate administrative class whose loyalty was to the state rather than to any other group or individual. They were incredibly successful and continued with only a few slight interruptions until the early 20th century. While there were different levels of examination, from the local to the palatial, and had different emphases, they primarily consisted of an education in the Confucian classics we'll be talking about on the next slide. Now, in part because of the stability of this more effective state administration, China becomes a center of learning, innovation, and wealth. This, combined with its relatively flat northerly geography, however, made it a prime target for invasion. However, invaders like the Mongols, who would later establish the Yuan dynasty, one of several dynasties northern invaders would begin, and that Yuan dynasty was part of the great spreading Mongol Empire we saw earlier in the lecture. These roving bandits found themselves needing to rely on the same class of Confucian Han Chinese scholar officials to extract all that wealth in China effectively. This is similar to what would happen later in the 19th century when the Europeans begin arriving in force, but that's getting way ahead of things. The last dynasty we see listed here is the Ming dynasty, and if you're going to write down anything about the series of dynasties that have ruled China, I would make it this. The Mongol Yuan were supplanted by the Han Ming, who were supplanted by the Manchu Qing, the last imperial dynasty before the Republican Revolution of 1911-1912, which will mark the jumping off point for talking about the birth of modern China. So, if you're ever asked, which you will be on Thursday for your quiz, what was the last ethnically Han Chinese imperial dynasty, you will answer the Ming. And fun fact, the Triads, a criminal organization that exists right up to the present day, had its origins as a secret society dedicated to the return of the Ming dynasty and the ouster of the ethnically foreign Manchu Qing, who we'll meet during our reading and in our lecture Thursday. And this brings us to our final slide. First, you have the Great Wall, really the Great Walls, as there are several stretches of wall begun and completed at different times and by different dynasties. The first section of the wall dates back to the 7th century, but most of the famous sections you would see today if you were sightseeing were built by the Ming. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given what we've been talking about today regarding its wide, north-open approaches, virtually all of the sections of the wall, no matter what period they were built facing northward. Next up is Kongqi, or Confucius as we Latinized speakers call him. He's the fellow on the top right. The authors of your book spend the preponderance of their time actually talking about Confucius and Confucianism in their chapter on China. So I'll just add a few things here to what you'll be reading over the next day or two. The first is that despite the presence of Taoism, Buddhism, and later Islam, and despite the fact that ideologically it is probably closer to a philosophy than a religion, for our purposes it is safe to say that Confucianism was the dominant religion in China throughout the imperial period. Indeed, even today, just recently, the Chinese Communist Party, who have ruled the country since the end of the 1940s, introduced a series of videos depicting Karl Marx and Confucius meeting and exchanging ideas. The other thing you might want to take note of, because the authors don't make this entirely clear when they cite it, is that the Analects of Confucius are a series of aphorisms later attributed to Confucius, and that Confucius himself is said to have simply been preserving a set of older classical texts by spreading their teaching. Otherwise, Aloso and Williford, the authors of your text, do a fine job as far as an introduction to the cardinal principles and virtues around which Confucianism is based. I'll return to Sinicization, the Silk Road, and major Chinese innovations in just a moment. But let's first talk briefly about the fellow at the bottom left here while we're on the subject of Chinese culture. This is Sun Tzu, attributed author of the military text The Art of War, copies of which are still in virtually every major bookstore today. Thought to have been written somewhere in the 6th or 7th century BCE, many of the aphorisms the book contains are applicable to the present day. One of my favorites is, "The greatest victory is that which requires no battle," a formulation he repeats in several different ways throughout. Basically, war is costly, both in lives and money. Fighting can seriously destabilize even the most apparently secure regime, and so the wise ruler seeks to win before the fighting even commences. Think of it as warfare by prior positioning along a series of dimensions. Another classic text, which is also relevant today, it was one of Mao's own personal favorites and has enjoyed something of a renaissance in contemporary China, as Xi Jinping, the current ruler of China, has attempted to lean on traditional Chinese nationalism rather than strictly Marxist ideology, and that's The Romance of the Three Kingdoms. This is an historical novel about the fractious years of the late Han Dynasty, and it was written during the Ming Dynasty. Much like Mallory's La Mort d'Arthur, that is, The Death of Arthur, the author, Lu Guozong, was trying to tie together a series of existing, mostly oral stories about the period, standardizing and preserving the traditional tales. Again, this was occurring in the context of the transition from the Mongol Yuan dynasty to the Han Ming dynasty, the last and greatest of the Han Chinese empires. And so the popularity of this retelling of ethnic Han Chinese heroism was quite understandable. On a related note, let's jump back and talk a little bit about Sinicization. Before we do, it is worth repeating that as a survey course, we're going to be speaking in generalizations. Even among academics, this particular subject is fraught with controversy. However, generally speaking, Sinicization refers to the process of foreigners, invaders, or conquered peoples adopting culturally Han Chinese practices, things like language, religion. This was similar to the case of the Normans of medieval Europe, who tended to adopt local cultures where they ruled and with whom they married. Again, there are exceptions to this. Finally, we have the Silk Road and Chinese innovations. Let's start with the latter. The Chinese were the first to many of what would later become the most important technological advances of the modern period, things like gunpowder, the magnetic compass, and movable type. The Chinese were also the largest producers of silk, and were the only producers of silk until several centuries after Christ, when a pair of monks managed to smuggle some silkworms out of China for the Byzantine Emperor Justinian. On the topic of Byzantium, the last picture on the bottom right you see here is of the Silk Road, arguably the single most important artery of commerce for a millennia, until the final fall of the Eastern Roman Empire, that is Byzantium, when Constantinople was conquered by the Ottoman Turks in the 15th century. Much more to say on that next week. We'll leave off today's lecture here with the last of the ethnically Han Chinese imperial dynasties comfortably ensconced in power. China, the most advanced civilization, state, and economy on Earth, and about to launch some famed, if brief, treasure fleets. Thursday, another invasion from the north will bring on the final imperial dynasty, the Manchu Qing, and they will extend Imperial China's territorial reach to its furthest ever extent into Central Asia.